essentially the East Coast equivalent to Slagle's Metal Blade. Johnny then leapt at the chance to be the one to release Metallica's first album, although, to be clear, he didn't actually have the money either. Now, his initial plan was to try and broker a deal with one of the major labels that were based in New York City, but that idea went nowhere. Still, Johnny believed in Metallica so much that he and his wife would put themselves in debt by mortgaging their house to fund their album. According to Johnny Z, quote, "We really took a chance with our lives. We didn't want to start a record company at all, but we ended up putting the record out on our own because of the lack of interest elsewhere." Metallica, meanwhile, with the promise of funding so they could make an album that fit their vision, drove 3,500 miles across country in a small van. Then, upon arriving at Johnny Z's place, they immediately raided his liquor cabinet and all got drunk, with Dave Mustaine reportedly puking all over the place, which obviously meant they weren't going to be staying there, but Johnny also couldn't afford to put them up in a hotel, so he sent them down to the so-called music building in Jamaica, Queens, which Scott Ian of Anthrax would describe as a, quote, burnt-out squad in South Jamaica in the worst neighborhood in Queens. The type of place that, according to Scott, you would risk your life getting in and out of. The music building got its name due to the fact it was used exclusively by local bands as a practice space. Indeed, that's all the building was supposed to be used for. No one was supposed to be staying in those rooms overnight, but that's what Metallica ended up doing as they slept under U-Haul blankets during their stay there. Now, Johnny Z didn't just send them down there to fend for themselves. Instead, he asked a local band that he knew, the aforementioned Anthrax, to look out for and take care of Metallica. A task they were more than happy to do, as at the time there were just a bunch of teenagers totally enthralled by Metallica's known life to leather. Indeed, the two groups hit it off instantly, and Anthrax even gave their new friends a toaster and a refrigerator for their room in the music building. Plus, they also let them come over to their houses to take a shower when they needed one. So, for a time, Metallica would live and practice out of the music building in Queens as they prepped to record their first album. Unfortunately for Dave Mustaine, though, this would be the end of the road for him and Metallica. While Mustaine was a great guitar player and had a big influence on the band in those early days, having co-written 4 of their songs, he was also a problem. Now, to be clear, the whole band drank, and they drank a lot, but while the rest were just goofy when they got drunk, Dave had a tendency to get violent and destructive. According to Johnny Z, quote, "It got to the point where he was in a real bad mood all the time," describing it as if there was a, quote, "big black cloud walking around with Dave, and I think the band felt it too." If anything, the rest of the band were more aware of Dave's issues than anyone else. They were seriously trying to become a professional band, and there was a growing sense that they were never going to be able to do so with Dave involved. There, for example, were accounts of him being so drunk during their shows that he would either play the wrong thing or would get on the mic and say something stupid to the crowd. There was a time and a place to be a drunken rabble-rouser, and on stage during a show was not it. Plus, even when they weren't trying to perform, Dave just had a habit of taking things to a whole other level and causing trouble as a result. For example, during their stay in the music building, Dave had a habit of getting drunk and piling all kinds of garbage in front of the doors of the other rooms in the building, so that when the band's Dave decided that he didn't like came in the next day, they couldn't open the doors to their practice spaces. The thing was, there was no mystery about who was responsible. Everyone knew that Metallica were the only ones staying in the building overnight, so they were the only ones who could have done it. Now, Dave has claimed that the real reason why he was fired traced back to when his guard dog had put their paws on then-bassist Ron McGovney's car, at which point, according to Dave, James responded by kicking the dog in her side, which, if true, is a shitty thing for Hetfield to have done. This then led to a fight between the two guitarists, which Mustaine has claimed was the real reason why he would ultimately be fired. A claim that I don't buy, especially since Dave himself has occasionally admitted that he was a problem, stating at one point, quote, "I just think being a loose cannon and not having anybody to answer to since I was 15, you get on autopilot, and you don't really care. In a nutshell, I was a violent drunk, and I was more drunk than sober, and I jeopardized Metallica's safety. Looking back, I would have asked me to leave too." Dave's biggest complaint, though, was that he was given no warning, although it does sound like he had actually been fired after a drunken fight back when McGovney was still the bass player, potentially following the aforementioned incident with the dog, I'm not sure. Either way, he was seemingly fired, but eventually brought back a short time later, which, I don't know, sounds a bit like a warning to me. Regardless, it seems like the main reason why they didn't give Mustaine any warning was because they were afraid of what he might do. He had a history of being violent and destructive, so they basically just waited until he got really drunk. something they apparently didn't have to wait too long for. Then, once he was good and drunk, the rest of the band packed Mustaine's stuff up and sent him on his way back to LA on a bus. Now, this did mean Metallica were now down a lead guitarist just as they were getting ready to record their first album. This, however, was not some rash, unplanned decision on behalf of the rest of the band. They knew what they were doing and already had someone lined up, as they turned to another thrash band out of San Francisco for their next lead guitarist. You see, Metallica's road manager had, using an Exodus demo tape, sold them on the idea of guitarist Kirk Hammett and his European solo style. They had liked the idea and were passingly familiar with Exodus, as the other band had opened for them a couple of times. So they trusted Hammett to hold his own as a guitarist, while personality-wise, Kirk was pretty much the opposite of the cocky, aggressive Dave Mustaine. As having gone to Catholic school until junior high, Kirk was quite shy and laid back. This new lineup then spent the next 4 weeks getting Kirk up to speed and practicing together before making the trip north of the Music America studios in Rochester, New York, a location selected on the recommendation of Manowar's Joe DeMeo because the location had a ballroom upstairs that offered some nice acoustics to record drums in. Everything then was coming together just like they had envisioned, with one notable exception. Metallica had wanted to call their first album Metal Up Your Ass, but distributors were not willing to put out a record with that obscene title, a situation that when bassist Cliff Burton learned of it led him to ask, quote, "Why don't we just kill 'em all?" in reference to the puritanical distributors. This frustrated outburst, though, would provide Metallica with a new name for their album. Now, the songs they recorded for Kill 'Em All were basically the same ones they had done for No Life Till Leather, just with their new lineup, better production, and a few significant exceptions. You see, neither Whiplash nor No Regrets had appeared on No Life, but now appeared on Kill 'Em All. Meanwhile, a song penned by Mustaine called Mechanics had appeared on the earlier demo, but it would not appear on Metallica's first album, at least not under that name, as Mechanics was filled with sexual innuendo and was just kind of silly compared to the rest of their material. So, with Mustaine gone, Metallica opted to rework the song, adding in a few parts while completely rewriting the lyrics, renaming it the Four Horsemen. Also of note was the fact that Cliff Burton didn't have a ton of input on the songs on the debut, as they had largely been written before he had joined the band. This was notable as Cliff was a much more serious musician than the rest of them, with an understanding of music theory. Burton then would have a significant impact on the direction the band would take following this album, but in the meantime, he added to the tracklist an extended bass solo titled Anesthesia Pulling Teeth. Most notably, the album that Metallica came out of the studio with was nothing like the heavy metal being aired on MTV. Plus, because Metallica were working with a small startup label like Megaforce instead of an established force in the industry, they were able to pursue and hone their sound they wanted in their own way without any kind of corporate interference. Meanwhile, back in LA, Metal Blade, who despite being unable to finance Metallica's first album, continued to help out other underground metal bands on the rise. One such group had formed in Huntington Park in 1982 under the name Slayer. The group had first started to coalesce when bassist Tom Araya started playing in a band with 16-year-old Kerry King's guitar teacher. When the group's second guitarist left, Kerry would be asked to fill in until the band eventually fell apart. Following this, King then met fellow guitarist Jeff Hanneman when King was trying out for another group. That particular band, it turned out, was nothing Kerry was interested in, but he had heard Jeff practicing the kinds of songs that he liked, so the two hooked up with drummer Dave Lombardo, who just happened to live down the street from Kerry and had heard him practicing. As the three started jamming, sensing that there might be something there, Kerry reached back out to Tom, and so Slayer was formed. This new group then started pursuing a sound that was heavier and faster than what existed at the time. In doing so, they thought they were unique, and thus were surprised when they first heard Metallica and Exodus, as those were groups that were making music that sounded similar to their own. That being said, Slayer were a bit different than some of these early thrash bands, as they weren't exactly huge fans of the new wave of British heavy metal. For example, Kerry King recalls hearing Metallica's cover of Diamond Head's Am I Evil before hearing the original, only to be incredibly disappointed when he finally heard it. As a result, the music they ended up creating wasn't just outside the mainstream, it was even on the edge of the movement Metallica was now championing. There really was no polish to be had with Slayer. Their music was wild, fast, and chaotic. They sounded evil, a lot like the one-to-wallop band that they did like, Venom. Indeed, Slayer, just like Venom, did not shy away from satanic lyrics and imagery, something their fellow thrash metal pioneers of Metallica did not embrace. As for the vocals, while Metallica with James Hetfield lacked the over-the-top dramatic, almost operatic-style vocals present in the more prominent British metal bands, Slayer stepped even farther away from that tradition with Tom Araya's vocals that were more akin to the screams and shouts of hardcore punk, another major influence on their overall sound. Also, unlike Metallica, who wore mainly blue jeans and t-shirts, Slayer were a little more over the top with their image in the early days, as they wore studded leather collars, spike armbands, and thick black eye makeup similar to football players' eye black, a look they fairly quickly abandoned once they picked up on the fact that the fans in San Francisco weren't digging it. Slayer would get their first major exposure through Metal Blade's latest compilation Metal Massacre 3, which was released in 1982. In fact, the song that they wrote especially for that album, Aggressive Perfector, was, in Tom Aray's opinion, the real definitive beginning of the Slayer sound. It was here then, with this track, that Slayer really started to hone in on the sound they had been searching for. Their subsequent debut album for Metal Blade, titled Show No Mercy, then matched the speed of Metallica's Kill 'Em All, but was wilder and more chaotic. The landscape of metal then began to change thanks to these two releases in the same year. Instead of technical dueling guitar leads being the standard for judging bands, now sheer speed was the order of the day, which led to a bit of a competition of sorts among the style of metal band. They all wanted to prove they were the heaviest and the fastest, thereby pushing each other to play faster and faster. The type of heavy metal these bands were creating would come to be known as thrash metal. Thrash essentially took the album and cranked up the speed and aggression. Thrash features fast tempos and high-speed solos, and would often employ double bass drumming. Thrash guitarists, meanwhile, would also often utilize what's known in classical music as a pedal tone or pedal point, which is a note that is struck repeatedly while other notes are played, something they would most often combine with a palm-muted E string to create a tighter, more precise sound. So, Metallica, Slayer, and others like them had finally found the faster, more aggressive sound they had been searching for, and would soon start to refine it further and further as they pushed the boundaries of the very genre they were inventing. Yet, still, Metallica and the other thrash bands were not attracting major label attention. Sure, they were on the lookout for metal bands, but these groups were not making the kind of metal the labels were after. Indeed, Dee Snider, who got an up-and-close look at Metallica when they'd opened for Twisted Sister a couple times, came away from the experience respecting the group, but convinced they were never going to amount to much, as they just seemed to be simply too heavy for the mainstream. Thrash just didn't seem to be radio-friendly, especially based upon what was on the radio at the time. There was simply no proven commercial track record when it came to their brand of metal, which kept these bands from getting major deals for a time. This wasn't all bad though, because this ensured that these groups were free to build up their own fan bases, define their own sound, and progress on their own terms free from outside interference. As a result, when they finally did get major label deals, these groups had already established their identities. For example, Metallica would not sign with a major label until after the release of their second effort, 1984's Ride the Lightning, an album that represented a significant step forward both musically and lyrically for the group. Much of this musical growth can be attributed to their bassist Cliff Burton, who was influenced both by classical music and jazz. He had a greater knowledge about music than his bandmates, who have admitted that they didn't even know how to spell arpeggio, much less what it meant before Cliff. His influence, in fact, can be heard from the very first seconds of the album, as the opening acoustic classical guitar riff on Fight Fire with Fire had been written by Cliff. Under Burton's guidance, Metallica experimented with different tempos and song structures, as well as guitar harmonies and counter-harmonies. Yet, even with all of that, they were still fast. Indeed, they almost looked to up the speed wars with Fight Fire with Fire. But along with that speed and aggression also came better musicianship and more complex songs. Lyrically, they focused on more meaningful and insightful themes that were present on their debut, an approach that was partially inspired by San Francisco hardcore band The Dead Kennedys. In doing so, Metallica eschewed both Satanism and the over-the-top party culture of the mainstream, instead focusing on more serious subjects like the Cold War strategy of mutually assured destruction and capital punishment. They also used for inspiration everything from the Bible for Creeping Death, whose bridge section was lifted from Kirk's prior band Exodus' song Dying by His Hand, to H.P. Lovecraft for the instrumental Call of Cthulhu, to even the likes of Ernest Hemingway for the song For Whom the Bell Tolls. In addition, the ballad Fade to Black was inspired by the suicidal thoughts Hetfield experienced after all the band's gear was stolen in Boston after a show. This independently released album, with its focus on musicianship and serious topics, would reach number 100 on the Billboard chart, which was a significant accomplishment. Metallica had been free to do things their own way, and had now shown that method to be successful. Meanwhile, the following year, Slayer would release their second effort, Hell Awaits, an album that was somewhat more polished than their previous effort. They had grown more skilled as musicians, and as their technical skills improved, the songs became longer and more progressive with tempo changes and instrumental breaks. Also, while Metallica didn't seem super interested in testing the limits of speed in heavy metal too much, Slayer was seemingly determined to continue to push the boundaries in that area. This helped them to find a rabid and growing audience. As